Okay, AP Bio final review, final video. We're going to be talking about two units today, ecology and evolution. And I wanted to leave you guys with one last studying tip. Google, way back when, released this thing called Notebook LM. And if you do remember those like AI podcasts, where people would talk about like study material, that was Notebook LM. And I honestly don't think that those podcasts are too good, but what they are good for is making flashcards. You have to take all of your study material that you've ever done over your whole year, take your answer keys, put it into Notebook LM, and ask it to make like a lot of flashcards. And that is what's going to get you prepared for the AP Bio test. Only slightly less in the MCQs. So if you run out of MCQs or FRQs to do, that's what you want to do. You want to make some study terms. If even better, if you can find like some definitions online, like a PDF, just copy that in and put it into Notebook LM, and it will make you notes for you, and as well as flashcards. But yeah, with all that being said, let's get right into evolution and ecology. So last time we talked about DNA, and we're going to start off with evolution this time. We talked about in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium the idea of selection pressures and like natural selection. And there is 3 selection styles when it comes to like how traits are passed on. There's natural selection. As you can see, this bird is trying to eat this guy or this animal, which we're just going to, for the sake of keeping it more abstract, we're going to call a blimbo. So this bird is trying to eat this blimbo because of it's easy, because of its trait. But this trait right here, it's pointy, it makes it hard for the bird to eat. So it can pass off its genes and it will survive while this one will not. And it's, the traits will start to look more and more like this one right here. Then there's artificial selection, which is when you're breeding animals. Gregor Mendel, he did this with his peas where he forced them to breed. That's how bananas are, so sweet. It's over years and years and years of cultivated mutations or breeding happening to make these like amazing bananas. Then is the sexual selection. This girl finds this guy super attractive, and she will want to have her kids with him. Right? Yeah, there we go. That looks good. So she and him will have a kid, and his traits will be passed off. But this chud over here, he's not getting the girl. He's not going to be able to reproduce. So, his traits won't be passed off. That's the main premise of that. And when it comes to sexual selection, it's actually usually the women or whoever is putting the most amount of effort into reproduction that is picking and choosing. That's why male peacocks look the way they do, and female peacocks look like normal, birds. Because these female peacocks, well, they're doing the heavy labor of, making an egg. So, the males have to work for it. And if that means dressing up all flamboyantly, then that's what they will have to do. Now, let's talk about the characteristics of a highly adaptable population. So, over time, traits can change. And the more, so can the environment. So the more a animal can, or a species can keep up with what's changing, the better. And there's 2 things mostly that help this: high genetic variation and high reproductive rate. That means that with the genetic variation, all of the animals in that species are like relatively different looking enough that, some traits are beneficial and some are not. And then with high reproductive rate, you're just making a lot of babies. So, the whole selection process is happening quicker and quicker and quicker. And speaking of selections, let's talk about selection pressures. This is what causes natural selection to happen, basically. Selection pressures are stuff in the environment which makes some traits beneficial and some not. So That would include predators, disease, climate change, competition for resources, pollution, habitat loss, parasitism. All these things affect natural selection. So in this example I made right here, the bird is attacking this blimbo, and that makes it a like predator thing. That's the selection pressure. Now let's talk about selection styles. So traits vary over time, and usually when like things are like adapting, when species are adapting, it will usually like follow one of these three trends. So the original distribution of traits in the blimbo population is that some have round tops, some have pointy tops, but most of them have like a middle ground between the two. Now, a directional change is when it shifts to one extreme. One kind of trait is way more beneficial than the other. In that scenario that we had beforehand, where the bird was attacking the round one, the pointy traits are more beneficial than the round ones. So, the population trait variation will start moving towards this way. Stabilizing change is when the middle ground is actually the best, right? And the extremes become inviable. This can be for multiple reasons. I can't think of any right now, but, diversifying change is almost the opposite of stabilizing change, where it kind of splits into two extremes instead of going in the middle ground. And if this diversification becomes too much, it can lead to speciation. Well, what is speciation? Speciation is when two populations can no longer make fertile offspring because they are too varied. So, a poodle and a pug, they can make offspring because they're, closely related enough. But a coyote and a dog, probably not going to be able to do it because they are two separate species. They're too far varied to be able to make, a good enough offspring, make fertile offspring. Every animal and every organism, in fact, inhabits something called a niche. So a niche is a role an organism plays in a habitat in relation to resources that are available. The ones the organism consumes, in relation to the resources that are available / the ones that the organism consumes. Habitats are filled with abiotic and biotic factors. And this is actually, pretty simple. Abiotic factors are like non-living things, like i.e. terrain, sunlight, rainfall, etc. A rock, abiotic factor. A biotic factor would be a living thing, like predator, grass, some other species. That's your biotic factor. So like a tree would be that. So we talked about it a little bit with the whole selection styles. But genetic drift is the change in frequency of existing gene variants in a population, and specifically it's due to random chance. So a bottleneck effect is a chance event that occurs, like a fire, tornado, the rapture, etc., that kills off part of the population at random, lowering genetic variation. So as you can see, there is a ratio of from pointy, mid to round of 4:2:2. But after this tornado comes in, the genetic variation goes from pointy, mid, and round to 1:2:2. So, it's less varied. There's less, like, middle ground. The founder effect is generally similar to that, except, these things aren't killed off. They just go somewhere else. The founder effect is when a small group branches away from a large population, and over time, it becomes so different that they become their own species. So as you can see, these blimbos right over here, watch these blimbos cross the river. And over time, the environments between these blimbos and these blimbos change so much that these blimbos are now more triangle shaped and these ones are now more round shaped as they were. And this is a example of allopatric speciation, which is speciation of a population that live in different geographic areas. However, there's a different kind of speciation that occurs, which is called sympatric speciation, which is where speciation of a population occurs when they live in the same area. So as you can see, these blimbos live with these triangles just in peace, but over time, these evolved into these, even though they're in the same area. It's just like a thing that happens when they, have to fulfill their various niches. So sometimes definitely on your AP exam, you will see a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram. And this is of, my favorite little animal, the blimbo. So it is basically a family tree, if you've ever seen one of those. You start with one trait that all the animals have, which is a round body. And then it speciates, okay? A round body, and it has 2 eyes. So this one does not have 2 eyes, but this one does. Okay, the next one has a hat. This one has a hat. This one has 2 limbs. This one has 2 hands. This one has 2 feet. This one does not. This one does not. This one does not. Same thing with a cladogram, except it's just, formatted a bit different. Eyes, hat, 2 limbs, boom. Speciation, we talked about it a little bit already, but we're going to talk about it a little bit more. Speciation occurs over time. There's 3 types. There's adaptive radiation, which is when speciation happens quickly when a new niche is available. Gradual, which is what we usually see, where traits change gradually over time. And then there's punctuated equilibrium, where long periods of no change happen, and then all of a sudden there's like these quick bursts of a lot of speciation really quickly. And there's one more thing when it comes to evolution that you will definitely see on FRQs and MCQs and stuff, and that is divergent and convergent evolution. So divergent evolution is when an animal speciation has a common ancestor in order to adapt to various environments, resulting in homologous structures. So as you can see, this blimbo evolved to have hands and to have feet, but these are 2 separate species. However, they still share the same homologous structure of this pointy little hat. Okay, a real-life example of this would be the wolf. It diverged into 2 different species, the dog and the coyote. And now one of them is more domesticated while the other one is a scavenger. And they have their own differences. However, there are some things that they share the same. Paw prints, a nose in that shape, ears, stuff like that. And that's their homologous structure. If you've ever seen a skeleton of a whale, they have these little things just randomly in their skeleton, and those are actually their legs. Because originally, whales weren't in the water, and their common ancestor was actually on the land. And that's just something interesting to think about. Let's talk about convergent evolution. Let's fix that sunlight, or that regular light even. There we go. Convergent evolution is when 2 separate species evolve to have similar traits based off the environment. These similar traits are called analogous structures. So this bird and this butterfly do not have any common ancestors, but they do both have wings to fly with. Okay, that's their analogous structure, or yeah. Coevolution is the last one of these. Coevolution is when 2 species influence each other's evolution. And that can be like predator-prey relationships, parasite-host relationships, mutualism, parasitism, communalism, competitive species, etc. And speaking of mutualism, parasitism, and communalism, there's coevolution styles. So there is mutualism, where 2 species benefit, right? Like a bird and a flower. There's parasitism, where 1 species is harmed, the other one benefits, like a deer and a tick. Communalism, where 1 species benefits and the other one doesn't care. There's this bird that feeds off the kicked up grass from a cow. The cow doesn't care about the bird, but the bird is basically dependent on this cow kicking up this dirt and stuff and shooting bugs in the air that it can eat. And when it is dependent on it, it is called obligative mutualism or obligated communalism. It needs the other animal to survive, and without it, it's gone. However, facultative mutualism is when 2 animals don't really necessarily need each other to survive. But them being together does help them quite a bit. So, for example, we aren't 2 separate species, but, let's say I give my friend rides and he buys me drinks once in a while. So, we have our own mutualistic relationship where, I'm helping him out and he helps me out. But we could do our thing separately of each other and be, completely fine on our own, but it does benefit us to, work together like that. Next, we're going to talk about zygotic factors. Zygotic factors are something that prevents the formation of a zygote. There's prezygotic and postzygotic. So prezygotic is, before the zygote is made. So there's habitat isolation. It's hard to mate with someone if you guys live in different time zones, that kind of thing. Temporal isolation, speaking of time, your breeding times are different, right? Maybe one animal likes breeding at night only, and the other one does it only in the day. They won't ever mate because they just different times. Behavioral isolation, which is different mating rituals that one party does not find sexy. So this would be like your ick, like, oh, I don't really want to date this frog because it's just not attractive to me. Mechanical isolation is physical incompatibility. The key doesn't fit the lock. We're going for this, not this or this, right? Gametic isolation. Sperm of one species can't fertilize the egg of another. Okay, that's pretty simple. Egg is not reached by sperm. Maybe it's just like the uterus is so far out that the sperm dies on its way there. Stuff like that. Post-zygotic, which is after the zygote is made, we have hybrid infallibility. So the hybrid offspring doesn't develop properly, so it dies young, for example. Hybrid sterility. So the hybrid offspring is viable, but it can't reproduce, right? So if you have a donkey and a horse mate, they make a mule, but the mule can't make any kids. It is a hybrid sterile animal. Hybrid breakdown is when F1 is fertile. So imagine that mules are actually fertile, but the mule's kids are not fertile. That's what F1 fertile and F2 not means. Invasive species. Invasive species are species that enter a niche that they weren't originally in. That's basically that. Okay, congrats. We made it halfway through this video. Next, we're going to talk about ecology. We talked about niches a little bit. Niche is a role an organism plays in an area. A habitat is the area in which these niches are found. A biome is like a large habitat, specifically a large geographical area defined by average temperature and average precipitation. Keystone species are found in these habitats, and it is an organism that will destroy a food web if removed. And speaking of food web, here is a diagram down here of the distribution of energy in an ecosystem. So first you have the sun bringing energy to the producers, your autotrophs, your grass, your algae, your plants, the things that photosynthesize. So the sun gives a bunch of energy to these, and it is eaten by primary consumers. These are your herbivores, your heterotrophs, your cows. They get about 1/10 of the energy that the plants got from the sun. And then after that, you have the secondary consumers, or your omnivores. So they'll eat the plants and they'll eat the primary consumers, and they'll get 1/10 of whatever energy they had. And then after that, you have your tertiary consumers, which are like your apex predators, like your hawks, your wolves, stuff like that, and they will just eat other animals. And that, once again, they'll have 1/10 of everything else. The basic rule is that every energy amount decreases about 10 times every level up. So you have 1,000 calories from the sun, become 100 calories in the plant, become 10 calories for the caterpillar, becomes 1 calorie for the bird. And now the decomposers, those greedy little bastards, they get all the energy from all these. I mean, they still get 1/10, sure, but they can, put their thumb in a bunch of different pies. Now let's talk about the over time, like distribution of these animals. We have, you can see you have time here on the x-axis, and you have number of organisms on the y-axis. And there's two growth patterns that these animals will usually exhibit: a J curve or an S curve. But before we talk about that, we have to talk about the carrying capacity, which is K usually. K is equal to the max population size that can exist without destroying a habitat, determined by, limiting factors. Well, what are these limiting factors? They're either density independent or density dependent variables. So you have density independent, where the population doesn't really matter. That's your natural disaster, temperature, climate change, sunlight, physical traits, behavior, etc. Then you have your density dependent ones, where it does matter the population. That's competition, disease, parasitism, crowding, stress, etc. Now, the J curve is an exponential growth that blows right past K, okay? And when it does that, it goes terribly wrong. It either screws up the environment for everyone, or it ends up realizing, oh shoot, now I'm screwed, and the whole population just dies in that area. The S curve, on the other hand, is a logistic growth pattern that plateaus around K. And they have two separate equations right here. You have your J curve, which is dN over dt, and it is calculable by your max reproduction rate times your population size. And that's basically the slope at any given area. Your S curve, on the other hand, is your max reproductive rate times, parenthesis, the carrying capacity minus the population size over K again times the population size again. And yes, you are expected to know these formulas, unfortunately. Here we go, last page. Animals will follow one of two general principles. They'll either have a K-selected population or an R-selected population. So a K-selected population is when there's fewer offspring and a lot of energy is put into raising these. So humans, for example, elephants, giraffes, etc. These bigger animals usually have less babies, but those babies live out their lives for much longer. However, our selected population, there's lots of energy, or there's lots of offspring, little energy put into raising these, and that's for example, spiders. But these, half of them will die in the first couple of days, or even weeks. And it's basically game over. So think rabbits, they have a bunch. Think the runt of a litter or something like that. There's just a bound of there's bound to be some eggs that break when making the omelet of keeping your species alive. The last thing is this one last formula, the Simpson's Biodiversity Index, which is equal to D, or is D, and it is equal to 1 minus the sum of the number of species of that specific organism times the number of species of that specific organism minus 1. So n, parentheses, n minus 1. And that's all over the total number of organisms times the total number of organisms minus 1. And this value will range from 0 to 1, whatever you get. And the closer it is to 0, that means that there's less variation in the whole species of the population. But the closer it is to 1, that means the more different species there are in that population. Okay? Thank you for spending all this time with me, watching all my videos. Like I said, if you like these things, if you think that whatever I taught you has, or helped you review, has benefited you in any way, please, 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 please subscribe. One thing I would recommend reviewing beforehand is your statistics stuff, what is an independent variable, what is a dependent variable, how do I make a graph, standard deviation, median, all that kind of stuff. You can probably find a video on that. That is actually Unit 1 of AP Bio. So look that up, but that's some pretty simple stuff that you might still have memorized. All right, thank you. And yeah, good luck on your tests.